Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Lowdown. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Professor Simon Chadwick, Professor of Sport and Geopolitics at Skema Business School in Paris. Simon, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me to be here.
Simon, as we begin with all of our guests, what was your earliest football memory?
Do I really have to answer that question? I remember the earliest football memory I have is I remember my father. He just got a car for the very first time in 1970, and he used to go and fill up at Esso stations. And Esso, if you've spent a certain amount of petrol on a certain amount of money on petrol at an Esso station in 1970, you got a free football coin for the World Cup. And I remember my father he kept giving me these football coins, 1970 football coins. God knows where they are now. I mean, long gone. But I remember thinking, why are you doing this? Why are you giving me these coins? Why are they? Can you buy anything with them? Which of course you couldn't. So that was my first football memory. So I have vague recollections of watching the World Cup in 1970, and so that's the reason I didn't want to answer, because it dates me considerably.
1970. And it's funny enough one because right now we have the World Cup right in our doorstep as we were speaking off camera in the middle of a winter as I'm looking at the snow outside my window just now. But I mean, obviously, you have this passion too, Simon, for geopolitics. You have a passion for football. Where did the curiosity to kind of look for the intersections and crossroads between both stem from?
So I guess after 1970 and football coins, I started to take an interest. It was my father. There's the ball, kick it. There's the team, support it, and away I went from there. And I'm in this sense, I was a fan in just the same way. A kid kicking a ball after school. I had my sticker album. Your dad would take you to the game on a Saturday. I'm just no different to anybody else in that respect. I guess the turning point, obviously, unlike a lot of my peers from my hometown, I went away to university, and I studied economics. And when I graduated, who could have imagined that you would work in sport? Nobody went to work in sport, unless you're a player or an athlete, or a coach. You didn't go work in sport. And so I went away and did other things, and eventually I found myself in the mid-90s sharing an office in a university. By that time I was a university lecturer, and I had hair, and I was a much younger guy. And the guy I shared my office with said, do you know anything about me? I said, well, no, I don't. And he said, I used to play for Aston Villa in the 1960s. So he too was an academic. And he said, shall we write something about football? And I said, well, yeah, okay, why not? Now, keep in mind that when we did this in 1995, the Premier League was 3 years old. And so we were talking about the commercial evolution of football and what the Premier League was really all about. You got to keep in mind the Premier League back in 1995 was very different to how it is now. And that was it, away we went. And this subsequently led to I studied for a doctorate. My doctorate was a study of football shirt sponsorship. That led me into working with organizations. Very soon after finishing my PhD, I began to work with UEFA, for example, and I still work with UEFA even now. But about 2008, 2007, 2008, I started to look at Asia in particular. And in 2007, in fact, in 2006, Qatar had opened up the Aspire Academy. And I kind of thought, well, what is this Aspire Academy, and why did it cost so much, and why has this country done this? But I very soon after went to visit China for the first time, and similarly, China seemed to be spending huge amounts of money on sports infrastructure. And on the one hand, one of the things I know about Qatar and China is there are kind of lifelong hardcore sports fans. Had this people who had the same kind of childhood as I did, but they're very different in the sense that the government plays a very prominent role. They're very different in the sense that They've got lots of money to spend, and that money comes from different sources, and they're also different in terms of what they're seeking to achieve. And so over the last decade, I've spent lots of times in lots of different places. Yes, watching sport, but equally also, spending time with politicians, with government decision makers, with sponsors, with football associations, and many others. And so I find myself here now with, kind of, I've got that background as a fan, but I've also got the background in terms of, a lot of my studies, a lot of my professional life has been spent inside business schools. But at the same time, as I say, over the last decade and a half in particular, I've spent lots of times with other people involved in sport, involved in football, as I say, sponsors, governing bodies, and so on. And so in terms of what I write about and what I feel really passionate about, everything has, I think everything is now coming together in one place for 1 month. It's a bit like, if you can imagine everything that you're interested in happening in one place at one time, what would it be? Well, I guess for me, it would be Qatar 2022.
Fascinating way to put it. And as Simon, it's something which you alluded to there just now. I mean, increasingly over the past decade, you've been spending a lot of time away from home. You've been visiting places such as China, such as Qatar, where football really can be levied at times as a nation building exercise. I mean, football is nation building, Simon. Where did the roots of that all begin?
If you, one of the things that I always do is wherever I go in the world, I always take a taxi from the airport, and I sit in the front seat and talk to the driver. And a great conversation start, because taxi drivers are, they tell you lots of things. They tell you the best place to eat, and they tell you the best place to drink, and they tell you, don't go there because you'll get mugged. So it's always good to talk to taxi drivers, and a great conversation starter in terms of the relationship with the taxi driver is, which team do you support? And inevitably the conversation then turns to the Premier League, and to Arsenal and Manchester United and Liverpool, and many taxi drivers around the world will say, I'm a really, really big Liverpool fan. I remember the days of Kenny Dalglish, or a United fan. Alex Ferguson was a great manager, and Ronaldo, look at what Ronaldo's doing, and how he used to be back in the old days, and so I think for particularly for people in, I guess, in Europe and South America, we tend to take a lot of things for granted. We may not even be aware of the things that we take for granted, which is the power of the sports that we have helped to shape, the institutions that we live and breathe these institutions, and we perhaps don't realize how deeply into our psyche, how deeply into our culture they've actually embedded themselves. And of course, when you go to places like, for example, Qatar, historically they haven't had that. So if you think about Qatar, prior to the World Cup and 2010, when they won the bid to stage the World Cup, what was the conversation starter with a Qatari? Oil and gas, maybe, or the desert, or goat herding, or so. There's something about the power of football. It's the people's game. It's the global game. It's a conversation starter. It's a sport around which there's discourse and narrative. And whilst we might take it for granted in Europe, it is something that other countries don't necessarily have at their disposal. And so, in essence, Qatar wants a piece of the action. China wants a piece of the action. Russia 2018, they wanted a piece of the action, because they all want to be part of this global conversation that we have about the game. I very often say to my students, and when we're discussing such issues, is I'll say one word to the students, and then I'll ask them to tell me what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And the word that I very often say to students is Brazil. Now, much of what people think about Brazil is bound up in football, because you immediately, when you talk about Brazil, you're talking about Neymar, you're talking about Ronaldinho, you're talking about Ronaldo, you're talking about Pele, you're talking about sexy football. And of course, the way in which people therefore conceive of Brazil, or they frame Brazil, is in terms of what they think about Brazilian football. And so, I know that the Chinese in particular, the Chinese want people to talk about China in a different way to the way in which we currently talk about China. Now, obviously, COVID has disrupted that. But prior to COVID, the Chinese government wanted people to talk about China in the same way as people talk about Brazil. In terms of, well, isn't it great? Look at this football, amazing games, all the successes, the great teams, the tournaments, the goal scorers, as they say, Neymar, Pele, Ronaldinho, Ronaldo. And so that's where I think the power of football comes from, because it shapes a global narrative about your country. And of course, if we're in love with the country, if we're in love with its football, if we like the teams, if we really adore their great players, then from that comes a whole bunch of other things. It makes diplomacy easier. It makes international relations easier. It helps to brand the nation. And we know best league in the world. And it's a story that the English tell themselves, best league in the world. But I think it's also a story that others around the world tell themselves about the Premier League. And so, in terms of social capital, in terms of political influence, in terms of economic returns, the best league in the world carries with it a huge amount of benefit.
I think there's something to be had there, Simon, in that, the stories we tell ourselves will soon become the stories that others will tell about us. And looking at the global governing body responsible for the health of the game, FIFA, and it's something which you touched upon on Twitter the other day. I mean, there is a gross misinterpretation, though, that FIFA is a Western organization. However, when it just happens to be based in the West, I mean, there's been a rebalancing of power that you could speak of in the last 20, 30 years from the West, which has posed a lot of governance problems, which you could say they could have dealt a lot better with.
So, I mean, I guess the first matter to address there is this different world that we live in, and I guess the people who might listen to this will have a mobile phone. That mobile phone will not have been made in Ireland, or for that matter in Canada. The reality is different components will probably have been made in different places. Possibly a chip from China or Taiwan. Maybe a screen or the casing from Vietnam. Obviously, in terms of the brand itself, the brand could be American, but it could also be South Korean, possibly Chinese. So the reality of life, the life that we live now is that it's global and it's very different. Certainly, compared to late 20th century life. And I would argue that the world is even, isn't even a different place compared to 2010 when the Qatar bid announcement was made. And so, we live in a world where things are changing and shifting, and there is this pivot from what people would call the global north, which is Europe and North America and perhaps Japan, Australia, towards what we would call the global south, which is Africa and Southeast Asia and South American countries like Brazil, for instance. So, I guess for the old colonialists of Great Britain, we don't live in the 19th century anymore. We don't even live in the 20th century anymore. We live in a very different world where power is distributed and used in very different ways. And of course, this means that what we've got is something that if you go back 12, 13, 14 years ago, but certainly 25 years ago, nobody would have ever have imagined a country, what is Qatar and who is it and where is it? I can't even find it on a map. And yet suddenly here it is, hosting the football's showcase national team tournament. And notwithstanding all of the things that we've said about Qatar, what I would invite people to do is to think about the significance of it in terms of our world. We have a changed world, and clearly this poses issues that many of which we're now aware of. So whilst we might be very tolerant and supportive of LGBTQ plus communities in Canada, in Ireland, in Great Britain, in France and elsewhere, we now have a tournament where attitudes towards the LGBTQ plus community is very different. And I know there's been endless debate about this, but for me, fundamentally, the changing world in which we has created this juxtaposition. And what we have to do is to understand how we navigate through this complexity. And of course, the organization that does this on behalf of football is FIFA. And I mean, it's interesting because somebody once asked me, would you like to be the president of FIFA? And I said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think this is one of the most complicated, it's like being president of the world. How do you navigate through this complexity? Because inevitably my values are not your values, and my morals are not necessarily your morals. And so somehow the likes of Infantino and obviously those who've preceded, but more importantly, those who will follow Infantino, will have to deal with this. And this raises all manner of questions about, what is FIFA and who governs FIFA, and who does FIFA govern on behalf of, and what principles should it adopt in governing on behalf of these people. And this is a really, really complicated task, I think. And I'm not saying Infantino is a good president or a bad president, but I think what we have seen is that Infantino has tried, but has sometimes struggled to govern the organization in this very complicated world. And I guess you will know, and many of the listeners will know, about the recent letter that Infantino sent out, which is, just play the game and forget everything else. And I do genuinely feel for the guy, because I still remember that inner child, kicking the ball after school with my, you put a couple of courts down for a goal, that's kicking a ball ultimately. But the reality is now in the 21st century, it's not just kicking a ball. There's a lot more that comes with it, geopolitically, socially, economically. And you can see how FIFA struggles to deal with this. Is FIFA fit for purpose? I'm not entirely sure it is. Since Infantino became president, has it changed enough, and has it gone far enough and fast enough? I'm not sure it has. But as I say, in defense of FIFA, in defense of Infantino, we live in a complicated world, and it's difficult to know how to govern sports, to govern football under these conditions.
It's a really intriguing one, though, Simon, as well, because this old adage about football as a reflection of society, back when I was growing up, it wasn't too long ago, I never really understood it, never really got it. Just being accustomed to watching soccer AM on a Saturday morning, watching the Premier League afterwards, collecting Panini stickers galore. And, to the best of my knowledge, there was only two strands on the news. You had the news cycle and you had the sports cycle. Whereas nowadays, I truly believe that it's broken into three. You have your news, you have your sports news, and then you also have football as a complete separate entity in of itself. And obviously, with the flavor of the month being the Qatar World Cup, I mean, this year you did co-edit a book titled The Business of the FIFA World Cup. I mean, for all of your studies, for all the years that you spent researching both the landscape of the sport, intertwining with the geopolitical economy, what was the one thing in your research for that book which surprised you?
And if I could just go back to what you said there about football reflecting the world in which we live, and you talked about your childhood engagement with football and Soccer AM on TV, and for me that was never part of my experience as a fan, because my experience of a fan was working class Middlesbrough, which is where I was born and brought up. My family were steel workers. And it's interesting that Middlesbrough, when it was first established as a club, was called Ironopolis, because it was an iron and steel town. And that's you played football and you had an interest in football because during the Industrial Revolution and beyond, when it got to a Saturday or a Sunday, very often you were just tired. Hard manual labor, 5-6 days a week. You work shifts. Maybe you'd had to work the night shift all night. You were just tired and you wanted to do something else. So you either watched football or played football. Now, I think obviously by the time you came along, and I'm guessing in a kind of 1990s and early 2000s, and you talked about Soccer AM on Sky, by that time, football had started to change. And rather than being just a social institution, it was becoming a commercial entity. And so I think that you consumed 1990s football in a way that was a reflection of the time. Premier League was launched in 1992. The Champions League was launched in 1992. You know, money started flowing into the games. You had big broadcasting contracts. Sponsorships became much more valuable. Whereas now, you know, unfortunately for you and I, you and me, because we're both old blokes now, you know, the young people of today are being born and brought up in a world of actually very, very complicated football, which is, it's not just about, you know, society. It's not just about, you know, where you're born and where you're brought up. It's not just about the industry that exists in your town. For that matter, it's not just about money and sponsorships and TV contracts. It's now about countries, and it's now about LGBTQ plus rights, and it's about sport washing, and it's about you know, buying a football club and spending huge amounts of money on it to try and buy the best players, because it's going to make your nation look good. So I think absolutely, you know, we live in, you know, we consume football, and the football that we consume is a reflection of our times. As regards to things that what surprised me about the book, nothing surprised me about it. Nothing surprised me about it at all. And reflecting upon your question, I think probably the big surprise in my mind, literally, that's just occurred to me is you know, talking about the business of the FIFA World Cup is a very kind of 1990s, 2000s thing to do. Maybe the next edition should actually be the geopolitical economy of the FIFA World Cup, because it's not just about, you know, marketing and jobs and money. It is actually about countries and political influence and societal change. And as I said, you know, said earlier, you know, this kind of pivot from the global north to the global south.
It's interesting about this pivot between the global north and global south, because, you know, it's within the context, Simon, I have to say, of this geopolitical drift towards the east. And in research for this podcast, it's something which you've described as the hyper commercialization of the game and of the sport. I mean, with that involved, you see a lot of different nation states. You see, obviously, Qatar, Saudi, UAE having these set of franchise clubs. I mean, what does that then entail for the future governance of the game? You could, in many ways, you could call it transnational governance.
I mean, it's again, that's a really interesting question, because I think that when I was a kid, you could easily explain football. You know, it was a sociocultural phenomenon. It was about your community. It was about your town. It was about your family. And then later, when I first started to research and write about not just football but sport more generally, it was at the time I was working in a business school, and I was conceiving of football in those terms. And so I was seeing marketing and sponsorships, and I was seeing issues of governance. You know, you know what? I don't remember sitting around in my house in Middlesbrough as a kid with, you know, my family talking about, you know, let's discuss the governance of the game, kids. You know, it was talking about, you know, it was talking about George Best, for example. You know, I remember George Best, Bobby Charlton, Manchester United coming to play in Middlesbrough. We lived opposite the football stadium, so, you know, let's talk about George Best. You know, and I remember my gran always talking about George Best. You know, he's such a show off, and look at his hair; it's far too long. You know, so it was a sociocultural phenomenon. Obviously, later, you know, going back to when you were younger, the conversations changed, and people started to talk about, you know, who's running the game, and, you know, where's our next sponsorship deal coming from, and have we got enough seats in our stadium to make enough money? And so the nature of the conversation changed, and the conversation has changed again. And the conversation now is about, as I say, treatment of migrant workers. You know, it's a long way from my gran talking about Georgie Best. She always used to call him Georgie Best. You know, it's a long way from my gran talking about Georgie Best and his hairstyle to now discussing migrant worker rights in Qatar. But I think that is how the world has changed. That's how football has changed. And as I say, I think you've got to keep in mind about FIFA. FIFA was set up in Europe by Europeans, you know, 100 years ago or more, and the world was very different then, and so I think FIFA and Infantino in particular are acknowledging this changing world, because there's now this report story that FIFA will spin out its commercial operations and locate them in New York, and I think that is kind of tacit acknowledgement that the world doesn't begin and end in Switzerland, and for that matter, the world doesn't begin and end in Europe. What's going to be really interesting moving forward from here is will we see, for example, a FIFA office in Shanghai, or a FIFA office in Tokyo, or a FIFA office in Mumbai, or Dubai, for that matter? I think also we've got to ask ourselves is, at which point are FIFA presidents no longer European? So apart from Havelange, a Brazilian, and briefly when the Blatter scandal erupted, a president from Africa, essentially all of the FIFA presidents have been European. Now, keep in mind that, for example, that the president of the FIA, the world governing body of motorsport, is now from the Gulf region. We are now beginning to see that the governance of sport is, I guess you might say, kicking and screaming, is now beginning to reflect a much more globalized 21st century constituency. And so, it's not inconceivable that, for instance, by 2030, we could have a Chinese FIFA president, or we could have a Saudi Arabian FIFA president. And this for many Europeans and for people in global north, this may be deeply, deeply uncomfortable, and it may feel wrong, and it may feel strange, but the reality is our world is changing, and the governance of sport will need to change to keep pace with that. And it's an inconvenient truth that we could ultimately, as I say, in 2030, have a Saudi Arabian FIFA president, for example.
It's the paradox of growth, though, isn't it, Simon? Because it's funny enough, with globalization, everyone wants to share the pie. Everyone deserves their time in the sun, so to speak. But to compensate,
I'll say something publicly, which I've not really said before. But I actually quite like people. I quite like people all over the world. I've got friends all over the world. I've got friends in Qatar. I've got friends in China. I've got friends in Russia. I've got friends in Ireland, in Canada, in Germany, in France. I actually quite like people, and I really like the diversity, and I like the culture. And there's one thing that really, that really makes me feel happy is to go to a place and be part of the local culture. It's just an amazing planet that we live on. And so, in this vein, I'm a great Democrat, I'm a great egalitarian. And I do believe, just as South Africa got its moment in the sun, and Japan and South Korea got their moments in the sun, we all of us, every single one of us, we deserve our moment in the sun. But of course, one of the difficulties is on this amazing planet that we live is quite a lot of us don't agree with each other. We don't agree on very much, and that makes governing a global governing body difficult. It makes staging tournaments difficult. And so we've got to have some basis upon which to move forwards and not only govern sports, but organize events and competitions. There are globally agreed standards. For example, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and these weren't created by the Qataris. They weren't created by the Americans. They were created by us all. We agreed these things. There are 17 of them, and I would like to see, for example, when World Cup hosting announcements are being made, that explicit reference is made in the bid documents, but also in terms of the award and then the subsequent evaluation of how well these countries have done as hosts. I'd like to see references to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So just to give you an example, in the SDGs, there's reference to the equal treatment of women. There's reference to, for example, the provision of good quality employment. There's reference to ensuring environmental sustainability. And so, given that we do live in this complex world, I think we need to try and rationalize it and at least try to bring some simplicity and common understanding. And as I say, I think those United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are one platform, one basis that we can use to make sure that football remains the sport that we love, but at the same time is able to keep pace with the changes and the complexities that we see in the world.
That's a brilliant point, Simon, too. But I think it's even beginning from the inside out. I think even a more stringent enforcement of these host nations being made accountable to hold those legacy plans. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, it's not so much of a stringent enforcement. We look at some of the stadiums from the Brazil 2014 World Cup, for example, being overrun, being used as car parks.
Yeah, I would say it's a difficult one with legacy because legacy doesn't always manifest itself straight away, so it's not within the first week or the first month or the first year after an event. Sometimes it can be 5 years or 10 years, or if you look at Barcelona Olympics in 1992, it took a couple of decades for the entire legacy to be realized. But Barcelona 92 is a good example. Great legacy, but it took some time to get there. So the question then becomes, how do you enforce that? You can't kind of go back to the Spanish government 20 years later and say, well, you know what, you didn't deliver the legacy, so we're fining you now. It doesn't work that way. So I guess there is an element of trust and faith and patience, and there's sometimes difficult things to establish and uphold. So I don't think we're ever going to get to a utopian situation where someone says, okay, we're going to organize this tournament, we're going to deliver this legacy, and then 20 years later it's a perfect legacy without question. I don't think it can ever be like that. But I think we do have both an individual and a collective responsibility as members of the global sport community to do the things that we say we're going to do. I guess, in this respect, you could say stop playing politics, or, stop using sport just for business purposes, and show some responsibility. That's a little naive and a little simplistic, I think, on anybody's part to say that. But, I genuinely do believe that for all of us who care about sports, we have to step up and we have to improve our standards and we have to be responsible. And we do have to ensure that when we stage an event, for example, that it does effect positive changes, and we can demonstrate, we can measure these changes and demonstrate them. But I think, unfortunately, one of the unfortunate things I know about sport is there are a lot of hangers on. There are a lot of opportunists. There are a lot of grifters. There are a lot of people who don't do the things they say they're going to do, and unfortunately, that does impact upon the kind of sport that we very often get.
It's an interesting segue, because getting back to the original point about the paradox of growth, everyone wants their slice, Simon. And that usually entails a bigger portion of the pie each time, right? But for me, I'm just making notes here. For me, it's a fine balancing act between that and the voracious consumption of the game of football already.
Again, that's really interesting, because I think that one of the things that Infantino, he did it at UEFA and he's doing it again at FIFA, is he's trying not to upset the existing balance of power. He's trying not to upset that, because of course, if you upset people, it makes your job more difficult. So what Infantino is a past master at doing is to say, well, look, I can't give you a bigger share of the cake. I can't increase your stake from 2% to 3%. I can't do that. But I tell you what, I'll bake a bigger cake. So you're going to get 2%. You're still going to get your 2%, but the cake is bigger. So that 2%, is in absolute terms is going to be bigger. And this is what Infantino does. But of course, what that then results in is this kind of hyper commercialization and voracious appetite and big broadcasting deals, big sponsorships, countries with huge budgets that can mitigate financial risk for FIFA. This is all part of that plan, and so this is why I position myself as I'm not a business school guy, I'm not a politics guy, I'm somewhere between the two, because being a good business person means that you've really got to understand the context within which you're playing the game, and equally, as a politician, you've got to understand you can't just be a pure politician. There's money very often at stake here, and at the same time, if you're just a fan, if you're wanting to watch, if you're a Qatari fan or a Saudi Arabian fan, or for that matter, an Irish fan or a Canadian fan, you got to understand there's a lot going on. It's not just about kicking the ball. It is about money. It is about politics. It is about kind of moral obligations. It is about egalitarianism and democracy and fairness and openness. And in amongst all of this, as I said, there is FIFA, and we go back to the point: is FIFA fit for purpose at the moment? I'm not entirely sure it is. How do you change it? That's a real tough question, and I don't think it's a kind of question that one person alone can decide. It's got to be a diverse constituency of people and stakeholders that do that.
There's that saying, in periods of evolution and periods of change, people don't quite understand that they were in that period of change until a decade or so, until after the fact. So the next question is intertwined with everything which we've discussed today, Simon. I mean, and that's, what does the football public need to prepare themselves for that they're not already for?
I mean, obviously, there's this thing about you don't know what you don't know, and it's only later that you find out that what you didn't know. And I guess for the football public, and I suppose by that I'm inferring that you're talking about fans. As a fan, I said right at the very start, I'm from a working class Middlesbrough Steel family. Nobody had ever been nobody in my family had ever been to university before. I was the first person in my family to go to university. And what I know is that you've got to educate yourself and you've got to learn. And in educating yourself and learning, I guess as well, you can't run away from the truth. You can't run away from facts. And so if, for example, you're out on the streets jumping up and down, waving your scarf or your flag because Saudi Arabia has just bought your football club, then, in one respect, good on you. Good on you. After years of suffering and years of hardship, you might actually win something. But that is not the extent of what Saudi Arabia buying a football club actually means. The extent is way, way beyond that, because here is a Gulf state, and that Gulf state has particular associations with it, etc., etc. By the same token, I'm not singling out Saudi Arabia. It could be a US private equity investor who rocks up in their in their Rolls Royce and says, I'm gonna make this the greatest club in the world, and we're going to be the most powerful commercial force, and fantastic. We're going to appear in the Deloitte top 30 money league. Nothing comes without consequence, and I think one of the particular things that I've learned throughout my academic career is you've got to understand the nature of cause and effect, and nothing ever happens without an effect. There's something that causes it, and there are outcomes or effects of it, and so as a fan, you really do have to think about cause and effect. What has caused Saudi Arabia to invest in your club? What has caused this US private equity investor to invest in your club? And what are the effects of that? And I hope that for lots and lots of people, you think, what? This is fantastic. Cause and effect, fantastic. I'm really happy. I'm satisfied. I know what's going to happen. In my mind, I know what's going to happen. I'm content with that outcome. But of course, one of the problems with cause and effect is that sometimes we don't like the causes and we don't like the effects. And so this is particularly, I think, when you've got to educate yourself, before you rush headlong into saying, we love the Saudi Arabians, we hate the Qataris, we welcome with open arms US private equity investors. This guy from Malaysia who's bought our club, what the hell is that all about? You've got to learn. You've got to familiarize yourself. You've got to understand. You've got to equip yourself with the information, because only then can you really, really begin to, one, understand the situation, and two, make a kind of reasoned judgment about whether or not you want to continue supporting this club, or whether you take an optimistic view of the future or not. So that's where I stand on all of this.
To play devil's advocate, Simon, I mean, to cast your mind back to your Middlesbrough days, do you ever think about what would happen if you never pursued this interest for geopolitics and sport, and maintained that blind love for football, as many, if not all, football fans do?
I remember when I was a kid, and in school, I get into like 3:20, and you're looking at a clock on the wall, and you know the school bell's going to ring soon, and you're going to run home. Like I lived like 200 meters away from from the school, and right opposite my house was the football stadium. We would put our goal out at the front of the stadium, Ayresome Park, and we play. It's there 3:20. You wait for the bell to ring, and you just can't wait, and just such excitement, and that was how my interest in and my consumption of football was shaped, and football on TV and the replica kits and sticker albums. And I remember the first time I got to stand on the Ayresome Park pitch. This was just like, God had descended from heaven. It was just incredible. Now I hate football. I'm not interested. I'm not interested. I never watch football on TV. I never go to games. I can't tell you that. In fact, the last time I went to a game, I went to something like a 12th division Polish league game, and it was great because there was none of the money, there was none of the geopolitics. It was just 11v11. Let's see who wins. You were sat right by the pitch, and for me that was real joy. It was really pure and uncontaminated. And of course, there was a couple of big mouths on the sidelines, and there was also the opposing player who really like putting the boot in, and so all of that was there. But it was just something really kind of pure. But when I find myself, for example, thinking about the Premier League, or when I find myself, for example, thinking about the Qatar World Cup, I just think too much. And as I said, I think the issues are really complicated, and I'm really, really, really interested in those complicated issues. I think what's really switched me off football is the grifters. Is all the grifters and the hangers-on and the freeloaders and the opportunists. I just want nothing to do with it, really, because it's not a group of people that I necessarily have something in common with. I don't necessarily share their outlook on life anyway. And so, I guess, and what I'm interested in is politics and countries and nations and states and culture and society. If I get the opportunity, if somebody says, "You're on holiday, Simon, in Turkey. Do you fancy coming and watching this, this 6th division Turkish game? Two really interesting. Yeah, of course, I'll go and watch it. I'll go and watch it, because I think for me that's something pure and uncorrupted. But otherwise, I've in many ways I've actually fallen out of love with football. I don't love football anymore.
And for your students, Simon, or for anyone listening to this podcast, what would be the advice or the set of considerations which you would implore them to look at before thinking about it?
Don't necessarily listen to me. That would be the first piece of advice, because I've fallen out of love with the sport. I would say that for people who want to go and work in not just in football, but I think sport more generally, is going with your eyes wide open. The biggest companies in the world are not football clubs. So if you somehow think you're going to go and work for Google, or you're going to go and work for BMW or Chanel, you're not. You're going to go and work for a football club. Most football clubs are small, medium-sized enterprises. They're not global corporations in the same way as Google. So that's one thing that I would say. I think the second thing that I would say is that in some ways what you see on the field, those players, whether they're male or female, those players, they work unbelievably hard. They sacrifice a lot to get to where they've got to. And very often to go and work, as a marketing manager, or as a stadium manager, or as a director of finance or whatever, they expect you to do exactly the same thing. So, you've got to keep in mind that you've got to be on your game. So if you're not a great player, you're never going to make it to the starting 11. You're not going to be a coach, but you're going to go and work in the offices. You've still got to be 100% on your game. The big difference is, of course, is that whereas Kevin De Bruyne or Cristiano Ronaldo gets paid a huge amount of money, for being on their game, you're probably not. So if you're working as an assistant marketing manager at an English Championship club, you are going to have to be on your game, but you're probably not going to get paid as much as Cristiano. In fact, I know you're not going to get paid as much as Cristiano Ronaldo. So what I would say is, incredibly interesting. I'm really grateful to football. I'm really thankful to sport. I really, I'm in debt to all of the people around me who've helped me and supported me. You can make a great career. You can go to exciting places, meet really interesting people. I've met some really generous and kind people, some really friendly people, some of whom are actually very famous. So, there are great things about football, but I think you do need to go into it with your eyes open.
That's a brilliant way to end the podcast. But Simon, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me, and apologies for the confessions.